Hello and welcome back to our School Finance Engagement Group series, part 2. With me, Dan Trudell, Assistant Superintendent for Business Services in the Troy School District, and I serve as the Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Rich Macheski. We appreciate you joining us for the second part of our series on School Finance Engagement Group. For those that joined us for our first video, or if you are interested in seeing that first video, by all means, please see the video on the school district's channels, or you can search by the name of this particular video itself. In our first video, we talked about school finance, and specifically, what does school finance in Michigan look like, and how does that impact the Troy School District? So we went back, with Dan's help, to Proposal A in 1994, and how Proposal A has shifted the way in which schools across Michigan are funded, and how that impacts the Troy School District. We talked about the various millage rates that residents in Troy pay, and how that's changed over time. We talked about the bond initiative, the most current bond initiative that we have here in Troy, going here in Troy. We went in depth as to what projects are currently being funded and so forth. And we talked about an enhancement millage, which is an opportunity that school districts in collaboration across the county can come together and put forward a ballot proposal for voters in Oakland County. And so we talked a little bit about that and how that would impact the Troy School District and every student, public school student in Oakland County. So again, encourage our listeners, those viewing this today, to go back and take a look at part 1. Well, part 2 today, we want to talk about, we're going to talk about revenues in the Troy School District, right? Where do our revenues come from? I mean, we know that they come from the state, and many are generated here locally, but specifically, what does that look like when they come into the Troy School District? So what do our revenues actually look like from a dollar figure and so forth, which is a big portion of how our budget is generated. When next we're together, we're going to talk about expenditures. So today we're going to talk a little bit about revenues, and then when next together we'll talk about our expenditures. But we're going to talk a little bit about the various fund structures across the school district. Dan's going to go in depth into that. We're going to talk about a little more historically about how revenue is generated. And then we're going to talk about the current funding climate across Michigan, and I'll jump in on a couple of these various points to share a little more in depth around things like schools of choice and some historical trends that we've seen here from an enrollment standpoint in the Troy School District. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about fund structures.
So looking at fund accounting, so we wanted to provide the community with just a very brief overview of how we as a school district are required to account for our dollars. So there's something called the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, so that's known as GASB in the school accounting world. They dictate that we are required to separate our funds into very specific categories. So you'll often hear the bond fund or the general fund. The preschool fund, things like that are often used across all the school districts in the state of Michigan. So for us, that allows us to provide transparency to both the community and our staffs, and then also make sure that we're in compliance based on the types of money that we're receiving. So we have multiple funds that we'll highlight here in a moment, but there might be multiple departments in a specific fund. So it doesn't always mean that a dedicated department would be a part of a specific fund. So the fund is kind of your highest level oversight, so to speak. And then, like I mentioned, certain revenues that we get have to be deposited physically into a specific fund. That way they're isolated for that specific use. So you can see here the district funds that we have in the Troy schools. We have our general fund. Obviously that's the largest of them all. That's where all of our general operating dollars are placed, and all of our staffing costs associated with those and any services that we pay for are in the general fund. We also do have a special ed fund. So For us, that's something that we take pride in, having all of our special ed costs in a dedicated fund, because it ultimately helps us with reporting and compliance measures that we have to meet from the state of Michigan. We have a grants fund too. That one helps us isolate any specific grants that you'll see on a future slide here as we go over what the state aid report is that we get from the state of Michigan. There's some specific grants on there that we have to account for in a very specific manner just to make sure that we're complying with any of the regulations set forth. We also have a food service fund. So because we get federal money to pay for a part of our food service program, we have to make sure that we have a dedicated fund for that as well. And then you can see the rest of our smaller funds here. We have a Troy Career Center fund in partnership with Michigan Works program in Oakland County. We have our community service fund, so that's all of our care programming and our after-school enrichment programming we have in that fund. We also have a preschool fund for all of our preschool programming across the district. That would include both tuition and GSRP funded programs. We also have student activity funds. That's for any fundraiser that students partake in across the district. If they raise money, we're holding those dollars for them, but we reserve it in a separate fund. We have a fiduciary obligation to make sure that those dollars are protected for whatever specific cause they have raised it for. And then as we talked about at our last video series, our debt service fund. So that's the money that we collect locally for debt payments. We have to make sure that we have it physically isolated in its own separate fund. And then we have two capital project funds. The 2023 capital projects is our newest bond fund program. So that's where the physical cash that we get when we issue bonds, that's where we have to deposit it. So the money for all of the construction projects coming in and out all go into those capital project funds. And then lastly, our sinking fund, that one is primarily related to just sinking fund activities. So we collect money locally for our sinking fund, it gets deposited in that fund, and then any expenditure that is sinking fund eligible would also go into there. So jumping into local funding, so as we talked about during our last video series, we have operating millages in the Troy schools. So we have our general operating millage, which is 18 mills on businesses, and then we also have our hold harmless millage, which is just over 2.5 mills on homeowners across the Troy schools. So both were voted for on by the voters, and we're gracious that they approved this for a period of 20 years. So we are set through 2044 as of right now. And so what that did is that authorized us to go up to 22 mills on the normal operating millage, and then up to the 5.7 mills there you can see for the hold harmless millage. And so why do we go for a higher amount than what we can ultimately levy? So on the operating millage, by law we can only levy 18 mills, but we can have the voters authorize up to 22 mills because, as we mentioned during our last video, we have what's called a Headley rollback in place. So we have to roll back those millage rates every year based on a factor that the county gives us. And that factor is based on the rate of inflation. So ultimately we need to roll it back each year little by little from that 22 mil mark just to make sure that we're not levying an amount that would exceed the rate of inflation or 5%. So what that does is that ultimately gives us a 4 mil buffer between what we're allowed to levy and what we're authorized to levy. So that just provides the district some protections over a 20-year period. And then likewise for the hold harmless millage, you can see there that we're authorized up to that 5.7 mil mark, but that'll protect us really up to 4 mils if we have to roll it back over a 20-year period. But as I noted on here, Troy has never levied more than 3 mills. That's just the way that the calculation works, which is ultimately based on enrollment and taxable value. So jumping over to sinking fund millage, so this is something that the voters approved in November of 2017. So that was a 10-year vote. It authorized us for up to 1 mil that we could levy for sinking fund purposes. So for us, that is coming due here in 2027. So that'll be something that we'll be working on internally and then putting out to the voters, hopefully for a no tax increase renewal to continue our sinking fund efforts. And then the debt fund millage, that one ultimately is the vote that the voters did in November of 2022. So when they voted to authorize us to issue bonds in $555 million in total, this debt fund is what we collect locally to make sure that we're paying back the amount that is required to make those principal and interest payments on the debt for those bonds that were issued. So it's a not to exceed 6.1 mils. So for us, that's a commitment to our community. While under state law, we can levy what we need to levy to make sure that we're paying back our debt. We've committed to our community that we're not going to exceed that 6.1 mil mark. And then lastly, but the bond funds, in particular the 2023 capital projects, that's where we house the money that we get. So that 190 million from the first series of bonds that were issued is deposited and kept in this specific capital projects fund. And then as we have to pay contractors for construction, we're pulling the money out of that fund and bank account. Jumping over to the state aid status report, so I briefly mentioned this before. So every district in the state of Michigan has a state aid status report. This is something that will list out the school district. It'll list out their funded FTE enrollment, their fall and spring counts. It lists taxable values. Pretty much anything you could think of with respect to that district is on that report. So you can go out onto the state's website and view all of these reports for any district just to compare. But ultimately for us, we want to look at a few items on that report, so the largest being the foundation allowance. So with Proposal A in 1995 going into effect, that ultimately changed how schools were funded, and it shifted funding almost to 80% from the state of Michigan. So that 6 mil state education tax that we're required to levy, that goes right to the state of Michigan, and then they're the ones that ultimately, through their formulas, split that money up across all of the school districts in a per pupil format. But the primary sections of that report that make up the foundation are the first 3 line items that you can actually see on that report. So you'll see them noted as 22A, 51C, and then there's a third line item that's listed as 22B/51E. So those 3 items together is what makes up the foundation allowance from the state of Michigan. And as I had mentioned during our last video, we are required to collect about 20% of this foundation locally. So that calculation comes out to about $3,100 per student is what the state's anticipating us collecting locally towards that $10,836 per pupil foundation for this year. So the 3 categorical items that are listed there are ultimately about that 80% amount of the foundation, with the rest coming from our operating millage on businesses locally. And then everything below that is what we refer to as categorical items. So those are specific dollars that are targeted for specific causes. So every year as the state passes a budget, which is on our end known as the School Aid Act, we, much like at the local level, at the state level, they have a general fund, but they also have a school aid fund. So it's just over $21 billion total that is in the school aid fund currently, and then from there they can allocate dollars for specific uses. So these categorical items are a little bit more restrictive in terms of their funding allowability, and so we have to account for those as specific grants. So as we get those dollars in, we have to put in a budget for the dollar amount we're receiving, but also we need to budget what are the expenditures relating to those specific grants and keep track of them throughout the school year. So for us, there's been dozens added over the last 10 years or so. That's always a large talking point, I would say, from the superintendent's end to the state of Michigan in terms of just having to manage that many number of grants and then the restrictive nature of those grants. And ultimately, that's what we have to account for locally. So I know there's an effort to try to streamline how those are sent to the schools just to make it a little bit more flexible for us on our end. And then specific categorical items require specific reporting too. So there's a transparency component to certain items from the state of Michigan that ultimately we have to report to them. How do we exactly use those dollars and for what purpose? And then we have to submit that report to the state of Michigan. Jumping over to the federal end, so we get various federal grants. While not nearly as much as our state funding or local funding, we do get a decent amount from the federal government. One of the larger ones being title funding. So this is a program through the federal government that is really targeted towards lower income students, and really the goal is to improve academic performance, improve teacher quality, and then provide equity for those students. So there's 4 main grants as part of the title program at the federal level. The first one being Title I. This program is geared towards math and reading intervention supports for low-income students. So we in the Troy schools have math interventionists at a couple of our lower income buildings that are qualified under this Title I program. And then Title II is targeted specifically towards improving the quality and the effectiveness of teachers. So this pays for a lot of additional teacher PD conferences that we can send teachers to expand their learning as well. That way they can ultimately bring those new skills and knowledge to our schools and ultimately pass that on to our students in the programming that we offer. And then Title III, this one is geared towards helping English learners really become proficient in English and then developing some high levels of academic achievement in the English language. So those are some pretty significant dollars that we'll cover here shortly, just to target those students specifically and their English learning abilities. And then lastly, Title IV, this one is all about student equity and providing a more well-rounded experience to students. So we typically have smaller programs that we like to offer to a particular subset of students just to make sure that we're continuing to give them the learning experience that they need. And then IDEA funding, so this is the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. So this is a much larger grant for us. So this targets all students with special needs. So if a student has an IEP, they are ultimately covered under this grant. So this basically allows us to provide any of the necessary or reasonable special ed services or programming or staffing that we need ultimately to service those students appropriately. So things such as special ed certified teachers, there's specific certifications they can obtain just to make sure that they're fully qualified to handle a particular disability. We have a lot of social workers, psychologists, OTs, PTs, psychs, speech pathologists. All of those are support services that we are required to provide to these students to make sure that we're accommodating the disabilities that they have. And then we also have some teacher aides in these classrooms that are part of the support system that we offer to our students with special needs. And then we also have to purchase specialized equipment such as wheelchairs and walkers and things like that that ultimately those students need just to make sure that they're able to move around the buildings just like any other student would.
All right, well, Dan, thank you. That was a really good look at, so our first video was, where does the money come from? How is it generated at the state level? And you've done a really nice job of now identifying where, when it comes to the district, where does it go? Mm-hmm. So these are the pots that the monies that are generated. This is where the pots of money sit. And then we have to determine how those are going to be expended and from a programmatic and from a personnel standpoint, and we'll go in more into that as we move forward. But one other area that we wanted to cover, because it's a question that I get often from parents and community members, is do we have a schools of choice program, and if so, what does it look like? And so historically, I'd say over the course of the last 15 or so years, if you go back to 2005, the school district, the Board of Education at that time, and administration agreed to start a schools of choice program, and that is completely determined by the school district. So the Board of Education and administration make that determination. Every school district has the opportunity to choose whether to be a part of a schools of choice program or not. So back in 2005, the Troy School District chose to begin engaging in a schools of choice program. And every year after, there was a predetermined number of students that would be allowed into the school district under schools of choice, and that was typically at kindergarten. About 90% of those students were admitted in kindergarten, a very small number in first grade. And so forth. We grew to approximately 1,200 students at the peak of our schools of choice program. The goal of the board was never to go over 10% as far as schools of choice is concerned. Around the 2018 or so school year, the board decided that we would begin to wind down our schools of choice program, and we would do what we called sibling only, and that if there was a family that had a schools of choice student within the district, a K-12, and there was another sibling that was kindergarten or first grade, they could choose to come in under a sibling preference. And so we've been doing the sibling preference since about the 2018 school year, and that has served us well. This past year, the 24-25 school district or school year, the Board of Education made the determination to increase slightly schools of choice at the kindergarten, first grade level, and for the 25-26 school year, they also chose to be a part of schools of choice program. So I think it's important because every student that comes to our school district brings with it a foundation. And so it's important to note that we do have students that do come to us schools of choice, albeit as far fewer than what we had seen previous. And it is something that remains fluid. The Board of Education on an annual basis can determine how many students they want to let in via schools of choice. And then there's a process that is very prescriptive, law out of the state of Michigan that we are required to follow. We mentioned when last we were together the challenge that we face as a school district, and that is the inflationary impact on the cost, basically the cost of doing business, very similar to what all of our families experience within their own home budgets. So this graph is an important one, and we'll continue to share this graph because our community needs to understand along the bottom is how much we have received since the 05-06 school year. On a per pupil basis. So it represents what we call our foundation allowance that Dan has gone into great detail explaining how that is actually funded. But we want to also show that the challenge that we face, the yellow line, is inflationary impact on the Troy School District. So if we were to have received a full foundation allowance, including the increase of inflation, this current school year, we should be at just over $15,000 per pupil, yet we currently sit at just under $11,000 per pupil. That difference of about $4,000 per pupil is about $55 million to our annual operating budget. So that's $55 million we do not have this year that we would have had had increases kept pace with inflation. And so that challenge we face is that gap between that inflationary impact and where we actually receive funding from the state of Michigan, and how do we make that difference up? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we face as a school district, and every school district across Michigan has that same significant challenge. What drives an important part of our budget on a per pupil basis is enrollment. And part of the challenges that school districts across Michigan and across the United States have faced of recent is declining birth rate. In Oakland County, we have seen significant declines in the birth rate. Interestingly enough, on a kindergarten level, we still capture the same percentage of students in our kindergarten. So across the county, there may be 13,000 live births in a given year. We still capture between 5.8 and 6.2% of all live births for an incoming kindergarten class. The challenge is that the number of live births just continue to go down. Although we're capturing the same percentage, that number overall in the aggregate just continues to go down. And as enrollment declines, so too then is there a decline in the revenue that comes into your school district. So on an annual basis, we're graduating about 1,000 seniors, and we're bringing in about 800 kindergartners. And so that delta, 200 per year, is what we're losing across the school district. We can supplement some of that through schools of choice, but only up to a point. And then the big question is, how do we then fill that gap? How do we make sure that our revenues and our expenditures align on an annual basis? As mentioned, birth rate in Oakland County, you can see this graph demonstrates how the birth rate in Oakland County has gone down over time. And you can see the percent of kindergarten births and so forth that we see here in Oakland County. So it just reinforces what I had explained previous. We also work on an annual basis with Plant Moran Cressa to do what we call enrollment projections. So every year we look at our projections going out multiple years. So we want to go out about 5 years. So we look back historically, and then we look out for the next 5 years to identify what trends might occur. So you can see on this graph, it demonstrates bands of students, so K-5, our elementary band, our 6-8 middle school band, and then our 9-12 high school band. You can see how those numbers are projected through the 2029 school year to continue to decline. And so as we think about declining enrollment, how we balance our budget with respect to that, because again, every student is connected to a per pupil, and our finances are built on that overall per pupil allotment. So that, again, those are some of the challenges that we face administratively, and as we work with our board, establishing our budgets and where we actually spend our revenues. Turn it back over to you, Dan.
So looking at local funding, so these next few slides just kind of dive in a little bit deeper and show physical numbers as well, just to put a number with the descriptions that we went over. So we've talked about operating millages. So for us, that is the 18 mills that we collect locally on business owners and secondary homes throughout the district. So for last fiscal year, so these are our audited numbers from last school year, just over $32 million locally is what we collected towards general operations. And then likewise, we have our hold harmless millage. So last year was levied at 2.72 mils, and that was on our primary homeowners throughout the district. And so for us, that was, for last fiscal year, just over $9 million, almost $9.3 million collected towards general operations. And then we thought it was important to note some investment earnings too. So that's another mechanism that districts have to try to generate some additional earnings locally. So we invest locally. The state law does dictate exactly what we can and cannot invest in. So it's generally U.S. Treasuries or high yield savings account. So for us, our general fund earnings, that's just all of our general operating cash that we have. So for us, that sits in a bank account. It just earns a savings interest rate, so to speak. So for us last year, that was just under $1.4 million of additional earnings. And then on the bond side of things, as we issue bonds as part of our Series 1 issuance, those dollars are sitting in a statewide, it's like a school investment pool. It's essentially a high yield savings account as well. So for us, that was about $7.39 million earned last year alone. So those are things that we often monitor with some of our advisors that we have, just to make sure that the district is maximizing the dollars that we're receiving just for interest. So that's simply just making sure the money's in the right type of account, and then that equals more dollars ultimately for our general fund, in this case, just under $1.4 million annually towards operations.
And important to acknowledge in that the bond earnings, that $7.4 million, we get to reinvest that back into our programs. And so some of the challenges we face from a bond standpoint, increased costs for construction costs, material costs, all of those things. As costs go up, these bond earnings, this interest earning, is great because we can push it right back in, helps to offset some of those increases.
Yeah, so for perspective, this bond fund earnings here from this first series of bonds that we have, we're projecting about $19 million of investment earnings. So that goes straight back into the bond program. By law, it has to go back into the program, and it can be used only for the same allowable types of uses for those dollars. So we factor that in our total budgets. Other local funding, so PA 18, this is Public Act 18 from the state of Michigan, which basically authorizes intermediate school districts to issue their own millage towards special education costs. So for the Oakland Intermediate School District, who is our ISD here in Troy Schools, they do levy a millage locally to support special education. So when they collect those dollars, they're ultimately distributing it to all the school districts in the county. And so for us, that was about $10.5 million last year towards special ed costs. So when we look at IDEA funding towards special ed, we look at PA 18 funding for special ed. The district still comes up a little bit short. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit. I know you do some advocacy on your own.
Yeah, absolutely, and we know that, as mentioned earlier, IDEA, that's the funding that we get from the federal government. IDEA funding back in 1974 was promised at 40%. So the federal government in 1974 said funding for special education students is extremely important. It's something that the federal government should invest in. They promised to reimburse 40%, essentially, of dollars that school districts, states pay towards special education programming. Unfortunately, the federal government has never invested over 18%, and in fact, currently we're sitting at about 14% of reimbursement for IDEA dollars. And so every dollar that the federal government does not reinvest or invest in IDEA has to come from someplace else. And so these PA-18 dollars are really important because they flow through the county then into local school districts. But in most cases, it's still not enough. And we're supplementing special education programming to the tune of about $9 million a year from the general fund. So it's important for our community to recognize that when the federal government makes a promise and they don't keep their promise, that puts more stress on the states. And then ultimately that makes its way into local school districts, and that has to come from somewhere because those programs are very important and must be funded on behalf of the students across our school district. And so that comes from the general fund. So whatever dollar we're spending out of the general fund for special education is less dollars that are staying in our classrooms across the school district.
So some other sources of funding that we get locally, we thought it was pertinent to share some of these figures. These are, I think, more relatable figures that you might see as you go to sporting events and participating in different clubs. So our pay to participate athletic fees was just over $530,000 last year. So that goes towards offsetting any of the costs associated with providing athletic programming across the district. We also have club fees of just over $100,000 that we collect from our families for students to participate in those particular clubs. And then also rental income. That's something that we as a district have had a somewhat smaller program in terms of rental income. So our goal is to try to expand that accordingly, have a modest rental program to where community programming and local sports teams can have access to our facilities, for a set rate. So our goal ultimately there is to net about $300,000 of total revenue from renting our facilities. We talked during our last video a little bit about the state aid status report, and then we touched briefly on a couple slides just about what this report is and what does it show. So for perspective, last fiscal year, we had $125.5 million of total state aid coming from the state of Michigan. And as we highlighted before, those three main line items is what makes up our foundation allowance. And then also it does highlight, what the state is assuming we're going to collect locally from our businesses as well. And then we also did want to highlight one of the categorical items that the state often refers to as 147C. So that 147C is a section of the School Aid Act that specifically outlines retirement costs for school districts. So for us, that's a dollar amount that we receive from the state of Michigan. So you can see last year we had two subsections. We had 147C1 and then 147C2. So these were two allocations that were given to us, much like every other district across the state. That figure is simply made up of how much is your payroll and then a certain percentage of that. But one thing I think is important to understand is that's not $11.5 million for us to just use towards general retirement costs. We actually have to take that money and send it right back to ORS, which is the Office of Retirement Services. They're the ones that ultimately hold the dollars for pensions and retirement plans for all public school employees. So those are dollars that we receive, but then we have an expense on the other side of it too. So there's really no net impact to our total operations because of that. So much like the other items on the state aid report, that it is purely a revenue and then we get to decide how we want to spend it. This subsection in particular, we get the money, but then the state mandates us to send it right to the Office of Retirement Services. So,
and I think it's important, and Dan, you can speak to this, but if you look at the total revenues in our school district over the course of, let's say, the last 5 years, you'll notice, like, wow, the revenues have gone up significantly. Well, that's not because we've received significant more dollars. It's these specific categoricals that you reference that are meant to be, where it's essentially a pass-through. They send it to us, it inflates our revenue numbers, but we turn around and send it right back out. So it makes it look like the school district and other districts are receiving significantly more dollars from a revenue standpoint, but in reality, it's not. It just, again, gets passed immediately through to ORS in this particular case.
Yeah, and that was one of the struggles going into this school year is in the prior year, the state actually had a section 147A4, which was the specific subsection. For us, they gave us $5 million of that 147A4 money to offset our retirement costs in lieu of a foundation increase last year. So this year, instead of giving us that money again, they took that $5 million away and then they gave us a foundation allowance increase instead. So the net effect, even though it was a historic per pupil foundation increase, the net effect for us was just over $500,000 of actual increase.
Yeah. And that's really important that I think we reiterate that the legislators, the governor's office, will suggest that school districts received historical increases. And if you're looking at it from a dollar figure, $1 more than last year is a historical increase. The reality is when you look at those increases and you look behind those increases at the categoricals that you reference, and in one hand I'm giving it to you here, but I'm taking it away from you over here, the net increase for the Troy School District, about $550,000, excuse me, that's about 40 or 4%, 0.4% of our budget. About 0.4% was the increase, and then I take you back to that inflationary chart. That's what's causing the biggest challenge for us. A 0.4% increase year over year, yet we know that inflationary costs are going up dramatically. Costs to do business are going up dramatically. The cost for employees, retirement, healthcare, all of those things, increases in their actual pay continue to go up, yet those the revenues from the state just aren't keeping pace.
So looking at the school aid fund more broadly, one of the biggest talking points that we hear about is lottery funding, and how the lottery funding just, all of it goes to schools, and that's what's keeping us afloat. There was a really good article that we have linked here in the presentation. Hopefully those in the community can click on this link and just view this article, but the website Bridge Michigan had a really good article of breaking down how does that funding from the lottery actually make its way into the classroom. And so when they actually look at that and seeing that maybe 20-ish% of the lottery money actually makes its way into the school aid fund and the classroom, it really puts it into perspective.
Yeah, and then the reality is that albeit all of the lottery money may make its way into the school aid fund, a significant portion of that is then removed from the school aid fund, and what remains is about that 25-ish%. Granted, it's important that we have that goes towards the overall school aid budget, but it's a bit misleading to suggest that all of the revenue, the $1 billion revenue that the lottery brings in, all goes to support schools, because it just simply doesn't.
And sales tax, that's another large contributor, in fact, the largest contributor to the school aid fund. So just under $8 billion contributed last year alone, and it's about 43% of the total school aid fund. So you can see here on this chart here, we thought this might be a good slide to show. So this was as of last January. The latest one was not published as of yet, but we figured the numbers generally don't change too much from year to year. But you can see just the breakdown on this chart from everything from income tax, state education tax, that's the 6 mills locally that we levy that gets sent to the state, lottery money, use tax, online gaming, real estate transfer taxes, and then the sales tax obviously being the largest. And then we have about $600 million of other sources of funding. So this provides, I think, a good overview of where does school funding from the state level actually come from in terms of you as a taxpayer and as a consumer. Where are your dollars ultimately going to support public schools? Just looking at federal grants, so we talked about title funding and IDEA funding. So more specifically, Title I, our allocation last year was about $320,000. Title II came in at just over $160,000. Title III has two different components that they break it out for. So you have your English learners allocation was $211,000, and then we have Title III immigrant money, which is geared more specifically to newcomers to the United States, just over $157,000 there. And then Title IV, that's looking at student well-being and well-roundedness, for us was just under $58,000 total. IDEA funding, we have two specific pots. So the first one being known as flow-through, that's what the federal government refers to it as. That is kindergarten through 12th grade special ed students. So for us, that was about $2.5 million last year alone. And then there is a smaller pot specific to preschool students that have special education needs. And for us, that was about $116,000 total.
All right, so that brings us to the end of our revenue presentation in our second video series. As was mentioned prior, the first series was to generally just paint a picture of what funding in Michigan looks like. Where do all the monies come from? Series 2, video 2, was to identify where are the various pots that it goes into and what do those dollars actually look like from an actual dollar figure standpoint and what makes up our budget. When we come together next, we're going to talk about our expenditures. So now we know where the money comes from, we know where it's at. Now, how was that money spent on an annual basis? Where does that money go? So I think our listeners, or those that are tuning in, I think will appreciate seeing exactly where all of those resources then go. And then following that, we'll talk a little bit about some of the other funds that we have here in the school district, and more importantly, advocacy. As was mentioned, part of the reason for putting the school finance engagement group together was advocacy. We know that a well-informed community, those in our community that understand how schools are funded, the challenges associated with school funding, we can come together collaboratively and we can advocate on behalf of our schools. One thing that is true in the Troy School District and the Troy community is there is a fierce pride in our schools. We see that on a daily basis. We see that within our community. I hear regularly from folks around our community just how proud they are, whether they've had individuals that have graduated from the school district, they have children currently in the school district, in some cases they have grandchildren in the school district, and they are just so proud of the opportunities that their students have either gotten or continue to get, and they're protective of that. And so I know we have a community that will advocate on behalf of our students, our staff, and our larger learning community. So I appreciate having an opportunity, Dan, to talk through these really important items with you and better help our community understand some of the challenges that we face here in the Troy School District and across Michigan when it comes to school funding. So when we're together next, we'll talk about expenditures.